So students, in today's lecture, we're going to continue with the final solution. And I'm going to begin today's lecture with a quote from a scholar called Suranjan Das. So Suranjan Das, this quote from him is in the context of a riot. However, in my opinion, it is also applicable to historical events such as a partition. So the quote goes something like this. A riot is a transformatory as well as historical event. It shapes and alters perceptions and aspirations. People are changed, their attitudes to each other and their ways of thinking about themselves are transformed. So, this is where the quote ends. Now, in my opinion, this is generally true about a riot. It's true about all riots, but it is also uh, true about major social upheavals as well. For example, a revolution or say a partition. So we are going to use the logic of Suranjan Das's quotation, and we are going to apply it in the context of a partition. So if you apply this principle, you get something like this. A partition too is a transformatory as well as a historical event. It shapes and alters perceptions and aspirations. People are changed, their attitudes to each other and their ways of thinking about themselves are transformed. So, this is the core idea of today's lecture, and in light of this statement, one can easily apprehend the change that occurred in the lives of people, of the millions of people who had to change, who had to move away from where they lived and come to the other side of the border during partition and afterwards as well. Uh, so, so in the story Final Solution, Manik Bandyopadhyay distinctly recalls the overarching effects of the peace committee. The peace committee is something that existed at that time after the partition. Its intention was mostly to ensure that partition does not result, that as a result of people coming from one side of the border and entering into the other, as a result of that no riots happen and there is no communal tension, or there is, in general, there is no violence. So that was the purpose of the peace committee. Generally speaking, it had more specific, there were more specific activities that it had to do, but we are not going into that. So Manik Bandyopadhyay also, talks about or actually comments on the rehabilitation programs and also the inhuman conditions of the refugee camps and the effect these places had on the minds of the women survivors, right? So because in this story the protagonist is female, is a woman, Mollika. So the story epitomizes the struggle of a female protagonist against a really depraved society, right? Which is capitalistic, which is hegemonic, androcentric, and even patriarchal to the core. So a lot of words there, and let's look at each word for a moment. So when I say capitalistic, I want you to remember that Manik Bandyopadhyay, I mentioned this in the previous classes, Manik Bandyopadhyay is a Marxist thinker, right? And you already have some idea of Marxist thinking because you have studied Gramsci before. So if you remember the core idea of Marxist philosophy, it was from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs, right? So that was the core idea, and Manik Bandyopadhyay strongly believes in that. And since he believes in that, he is able to see that as a result of refugees moving in from Bangladesh to West Bengal, this has not happened at all. Rather, what has happened is something very capitalistic. Capitalistic in what sense? Now, you have to note here that the core idea of capitalism is to make profit. Now, making profit is not always a bad thing, right? It's not a bad thing generally, right? But there are circumstances where capitalism or making excessive profit is even inhuman and immoral. For example, think of the current COVID scenario, right? You are all aware it. I do not aware of it. I do not have to tell you anything extra. So, for example, there are people who are charging exorbitant prices for oxygen cylinders, right? You know that life-saving medicines are being black marketed. You know that black marketeers are selling fire extinguishers, calling them or disguising them as oxygen cylinders. These are all happening. So you see, this is the kind of bad profit making. This is the kind of evil capitalistic mentality, that you have to make profit no matter what, no matter what the circumstances of the people you are making profit of are. You still have to make profit. And this is something Manik Bandyopadhyay criticizes in this novel. If you have read the not novel, sorry, short story. So if you have read the short story, you are already aware that Mollika is the protagonist, and the villain, as it were, is Promotho. And the problem with Promotho is that he wants to make profit. He wants to throw Mollika into prostitution, and as a result, he wants to make profit, right? So this is one of the things, one of the factors or elements in this story that you have to be aware of, that there are people in this world who would want to make profit no matter what, even if people around them are suffering, dying, living under the worst of circumstances. They're still going to try and make profit. This is happening before our eyes today, so it's not a strange thing. It's not something, it's not a distant dream, right? It's not a distant nightmare. It's happening here and now. So what is androcentric? Andro means man, centric means centered on the man, right? So essentially androcentric centric basically means that the world or society at large is centered around the wishes or desires of men, right? This is very intrinsically tied to patriarchy, which is basically rule of the man, right? And as you know, feminism is actually a movement against this androcentrism or patriarchy. It's a movement which tries to bring both men and women to the same footing, right? Where one does not have an axiomatic advantage over the other, right? So this is one core idea of feminism. It is not immediately relevant to the text, but it is possible to argue that it is possible, I'm just saying it's possible to argue that Mollika is a feminist in a way, but you will have to provide evidences if you make that argument. All right, so this story recounts the economic deprivation and uncertainty for the lower classes in the immediate aftermath of partition, right? So this is where I want to talk to you about a very important concept. This lecture began with a quote on how partition is a transformatory act. It is not just a historical event. Historical event it certainly is, but it is also a transformative event, and it transforms how people think about each other, how people think about themselves, and so on and so forth. But there is yet another aspect of partition that we need to talk about in the context of this story, and that is the fact that the final solution recounts or tells us the story of economic deprivation, right? As you know, economic deprivation is one of the core points of discussion in Marxism, and Manik Bandyopadhyay does not leave any stone unturned while doing that. And economic deprivation always comes with uncertainty. And who does economic deprivation hit the most, hit the worst, right? It is obviously the lower classes. So people who are economically and socially well off were and continue to be in a much better position when such traumatic and transformatory historical events occur. So for example, when the partition took place, there were richer people who could simply take a flight and move to another country, right, and settle there. And then there are people such as Mollika's family in this short story who simply cannot afford a flight. In fact, for all we know, they can't even afford a bus ticket, right? So the point is that any historical event, any event that affects people negatively does not affect everyone the same way, right? And one's class position becomes a determiner in how this event, such as partition or a riot or a revolution or even a pandemic for that matter, affects people, right? You all know that the lockdown, when it was first imposed, it affected people in different ways, right? It affected people, some people in extremely negative ways. A lot of people lost their jobs. A lot of people had to leave the cities. You know about the migrant workers. You know that they had to, leave the cities, and they had, many of them had to walk. Millions of them had to walk. So the point I'm trying to drive here is that whenever such an event happens, whenever there's a social upheaval, when there is a disturbance, whenever there is a social calamity or even natural calamity, so generally any kind of calamity, uh, people of different strata in society are affected differently. Some people, when the virus is rampant, a lot of people, and you will know about some of these people if you follow the news, if you are on social media, you will know that there are people who have just taken a flight and really and they have landed on another country as the pandemic ravages through our country. On the other hand, there are people who simply do not have that option, right? So that is the point that you need to take away from today's lecture, and also the point, one of the points that you need to take away from the final solution. So in this context, I'm going to talk to you about one really important idea from another Marxist thinker, or rather post-Marxist thinker, because this thinker does not really associate himself with Marxism. The name of this thinker is Pierre Bourdieu. He's French. You have studied an Italian thinker in your previous semester in the form of Antonio Gramsci. So Marx was German, Gramsci was Italian. Today we are going to talk about one French thinker called Pierre Bourdieu, and we will see how his ideas may be relevant or are relevant to our discussion of the final solution, and particularly this point that events like partition, events like riots, even like social calamities or natural calamities or pandemics, they lead to economic deprivation and uncertainty for the lower classes in a way which more privileged people do not suffer from. So, Pierre Bourdieu talks about two things. One is economic capital, one is social capital, also called cultural capital. Now, cultural capital and social capital are not necessarily the same thing. There are differences, there are important differences. But yes, today's class is going to be a blanket discussion on these terms, so I'm not going to tell you what specific differences are there between social capital and cultural capital. If you want to know more, obviously you can go ahead and read about it. If you want me to talk about it later, we can do that as well. But the point is, try and see the difference between economic capital and social capital or cultural capital. For today's class, I will be using these two terms, cultural capital and social capital, interchangeably, though keep in mind that they are not always interchangeable, because there are very important differences as well. All right, so economic capital is something that you are all aware of. Economic capital basically amounts to money or principal in the language of economics. So if you have a lot of money, you have a lot of economic capital. If you don't have money, you don't have economic capital at all. However, social capital is a bit more complex, and Pierre Bourdieu argues that in our lives, in society, social capital or the absence of social capital hits people harder, way harder than the absence of economic capital hits them. And this is what we are going to try and understand and then see in the context of the final solution. All right, so let's take the example of two people, individual A and individual B. And by this hypothetical example, by the way of this hypothetical individual A and individual B, we are going to try and understand the difference between economic and cultural capital or social capital. So, as you know, economic capital is money. So let us say that individual A and individual B both earn the same amount of money, right? So in terms of economic capital, they are both on the same plane. One is not better off than the other. However, social capital is very significant too. I will talk about social capital by giving you an example, right? So imagine, this is not something you have to imagine because it's happening right now. So let's say in our ongoing pandemic, this godforsaken pandemic, both these individuals have someone in their families who is sick, right? And needs immediate medication, immediate consultation with a doctor, and probably immediate hospitalization, God forbid. The point is, let's say, despite the fact that individual A and individual B earn the same amount of money, individual A is a first generation learner and individual B is, say, a 10th generation learner. So what is the difference? So individual A, when I say he's a first generation learner, I mean that he is the first person in his entire family, extended family, in his ancestry to have been to school, right? And the 10th generation learner, individual B, his family has had education for at least 10 generations. All right. So you might wonder, sir, if both of them are earning the same money, is there really any difference in society? There is a heck of a difference. Okay, and that's what we're going to see here. So individual A is the first generation learner, and his 10 previous generations were all farmers or engaged in agriculture or some sort of craft. Maybe they were weavers or farmers. Basically, they were not educated people. In contrast, individual B, whose family has had education, access to education for 10 generations, has this person has doctors within his family, right? This person has a professor in his family. This person has an engineer in his family. On the other hand, or perhaps not in his immediate family, but definitely so in his extended family, or among his friends. Now remember, the person who is a first generation learner, when he makes friends, his friends are also part of his network, right? His social network. And as for individual B, who is a 10th generation learner, his friends and relatives are also part of his network. However, talking about, if you take individual A in isolation, you will begin to see that the previous 10 generations of individual A did not have any social capital. They were weavers, they were farmers. There were no doctors, no engineers, no professors in their family. Individual B has professors, doctors, engineers, nurses, perhaps entrepreneurs in his or her extended family or in his own family, or perhaps among his friends' families, or perhaps his father's friends' families. I hope here you are beginning to see what point I am trying to make. Individual A, first generation learner, does not directly have access to doctors, to engineers, to medical facilities, to professors, etc. Right? Individual A cannot make a call to a hospital administrator and book a bed. Individual B is in a much more likely position to do that, right? Because probably someone in his family probably is a doctor. Someone in his family is probably a part of a board which runs a hospital. You see where I'm going? So this has nothing to do with economic capital, everything to do with cultural or social capital. So social capital or cultural capital essentially amounts to the amount of connections a person has in society. So the first generation learner will always have a drastically less amount of social or cultural capital as compared to individual B, who is a 10th generation learner. And not only does he or she have his connections or her connections in society, but also has the advantage or advantages of the social networks of his father, his mother, his extended family, who have had such networks for 10 generations, right? So you see, this person is has a massive advantage over individual A. So let's say today, if both of them were to require a hospital bed, who do you think is most likely to get it? Individual A or individual B? This is a question I'm leaving you with. Let me know your answer. Pierre Bourdieu has a very obvious answer to this. And if you have understood this concept properly, concept of social capital, you should be able to give the answer that Pierre Bourdieu anticipated. All right. So this is an idea that I wanted to convey to your class today, because this is one idea which helps us understand the final solution even better. Because Mallika's family is a family which does not have that social network. you can, if you have read the story, you know she does not have any connections or relatives to reach out to who can provide her husband with a job or with her with a decent job, right? And she also does not have the social capital to reach out to a doctor among her relatives and get treatment for her sick husband, right? So these are the massive differences between people who are in the receiving end of any social crisis as compared to people who are capitalistic and trying to make profit out of any situation, like in this story, Promotho, right? So one final word before I leave you with this lecture is that this story also captures the ruthlessness, the intolerance, and the manipulative nature of the exploiter, the capitalist, right? So when I say capitalist, do not imagine that I am telling that all capitalism is bad. I'm not going to tell you what my views on economy are, but what I'm trying to say here is that there is, within capitalism, there is decent profit making. There is also exploiting, making profit by exploiting people or by taking advantage of people. You know, like selling them fire extinguishers by calling them oxygen cylinders when someone really needs oxygen, right? Or selling a life-saving medicine in the black market and charging 100 times or 50 times the price of the actual medicine, right? Or hoarding medicines. You probably know about hoarding medicines, right? So I'll give you one. This is the example I will leave you with, and this is happening right now, and you will see the type of capitalism or bad exploitative capitalism I'm talking about in the form of Promotho. So you know, if you are following the news, if you are aware of what is going on around you, you will probably know that there are people who have, you know, somehow managed to get life-saving medicines off the shelves of suppliers, and they are keeping those medicines with them. They are not, you know, they are not letting go of that medicine in the open market. As a result, in the actual market, in the medical shops where people go to buy, they do not get that medicine because someone else has already hoarded them, right? And keeping those medicines with them. So naturally, due to the simple law of demand and supply, the prices of those medicines go up. And so let's say that medicine costs 1000 rupees, and people, 100 people go to the medical store and find that that medicine simply isn't there. So where will these people go next? They will look up from sources or other sources such as the black market, and the black marketeer has already hoarded. The medicine was actually available in the store, but somehow he managed to, you know, in whatever way he managed is not important. The important thing is he did manage to hoard those medicines, and now he will sell that 1000 rupee medicine. He will sell a vial of worth 1000 rupees for say 40,000 rupees. That is happening. So that is the kind of capitalism which Promotho practices in this short story, and that is the kind of capitalism which Manik Bandyopadhyay is very critical about in this story, right? So I will leave you with that thought. The task that I have given you is very important. It is a mental exercise, between individual A and individual B, who will be in a better position to get his or her relative admitted to a hospital in a scenario where he has 10 generations worth of cultural capital, and this person is just a first generation learner who has only 1 generation worth of cultural capital. All right, so this class ends here.